All right, welcome back, everyone, to this after tea session. And for this next session, all the presenters are in the auditorium. So we're looking forward to hearing from Isabel Rawlins, Marike, Beyers, and Anthea, Garman. And first up, I'm not introducing each one because you've all had the abstract. So to just say, we're welcoming Isabel Rawlins from the University of Zululand, and she's going to be talking about the tear of the tortoise, making peace with nature in Carol Campbell's third novel.
Thank you, Crystal, and thank you to Amazwi for hosting us today. In the early 2000s, environmental philosopher Derek Turner asked the question, are we at war with nature? He addressed the question by looking to William James, who a century ago proposed that instead of waging war against one another, we should conscript young people to serve in the ongoing war against nature. From our position in 2022, his suggestion is arresting. James's analogy was not meant to incite the destruction of nature, but rather to redirect the energy wasted on wars and have young people toiling instead in mines, on trains, in fishing fleets, and at foundries and building sites to, I quote, have the childishness knocked out of them and to come back into society with healthier sympathies and soberer ideals. He imagined these labors would even out the injustices wrought by social class and teach the youth the same kind of discipline they would have learned from war. Turner reflects on James's use of the analogy because from where we stand in the 21st century, being at war with nature has become negative, an accusation, and one used as a call to defend the environment and save it from unjust human aggression. Turner argues that using the rhetoric of war in service of environmentalism is dangerous. He explains that warlike imagery could be used to justify warlike acts, and he considers it problematic for environmentalists interested in preventing the destruction of nature to unleash their own proverbial dogs of war. In his estimation of these dangers, Turner allows one exception, where the analogy may prove useful, and that is when it is used to imagine making peace with nature. UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres did just this when he invoked the analogy to imagine a different future. In UNEP's 2021 synthesis report, he called humanity's war on nature both senseless and suicidal. Further, that the impacts and threats of the climate emergency, the biodiversity crisis, and the pollution that kills millions of people every year have left the planet broken. Accordingly, he implores present generations to make peace with nature. The analogy of being at war with nature construes it as an enemy, something opposed and alien to ourselves. While this can serve as a starting point, as Turner has suggested, to work towards making peace with nature, we need to recognize our environments as integral parts of ourselves. Can you show my screen? Thanks. Material eco-criticism counters the perceived divide between humans and environments by advocating that human bodies and minds are fully ensconced in material environments which shape us just as vividly as we shape them. Serenella Iovino and Serpil Opperman, editors of the book Material Eco-Criticism, outline our such integration thus, I quote, "The world's material phenomena are knots in a vast network of agencies which can be read and interpreted as forming narratives, stories. They read all matter as storied matter, producing a material mesh of meanings, properties, and processes in which human and non-human players are interlocked in networks. Through the conception of storied matter, Iovino and Opperman draw attention to the idea that, I quote, every living creature, from humans to fungi, tells evolutionary stories of coexistence, and that whether perceived or interpreted by the human mind or not, these stories shape trajectories that have a formative, inactive power. In this paper, I wish to read the storied matter in Carol Campbell's third novel, The Tortoise Cried Its Only Tear, set in the Klein Karoo between Beaufort West and Oudtshoorn. The narrative perspective shifts between the characters, Sina, Boetie, and Krikkie, as the three main focalizers. The narrative time, too, alternates between chapters titled Now, in the present, where an adult Sina is running away on the Sand River Road after murdering Boetie, and the before chapters, which detail the childhoods of the three children, leading up to the present. All three of them have experienced personal trauma, in some instances as children, and in others as adults too. I will show how both Sina and Krikkie heal from their trauma through their encounters in and with the storied matter of the Karoo. For Sina, part of her healing comes from a reconnection to her heritage, inspired by the Karoo itself. Krikkie finds peace working on a farm, but his healing is tied in with Sina, and only when he reunites with her does he truly make peace. Boetie, on the other hand, is hardened by his trauma, and neither the environment nor Sina can help him overcome it. The Karoo thus enables Sina and Krikkie to overcome the traumas of their past. Through this process, they become aware of their integration with the environment, and in making peace with themselves, they make peace with nature too. In another conference paper on Carol Campbell's first novel, My Children Have Faces, I used eco-theorist Stacey Alamo's concept of transcorporeality to explore the ways in which the Karakimensa, or donkey cart people, of the novel interact with the Karoo environment. There, I argued that Campbell uses animal imagery to engage her characters transcorporeally with the Karoo, an environment which, in its harshness, renders them vulnerable, but also inspires their resilience. As in her first novel, In the Tortoise Cried Its Only Tear, Campbell brings to life the world of the Karakimensa, whom anthropologist Michael de Jong names rural foragers, the modern nomads of the Great Karoo. Both de Jong and Timothy Gabb, in a recent documentary, The Lost Carts of the Karoo, have remarked on the loss of this nomadic lifestyle. Karakimensa were once employed as itinerant farm laborers to shear sheep and fix fences, but the demand for this kind of work has almost disappeared, leaving many people close to destitute. The characters in this novel reflect these lifestyle changes. While her first novel detailed the last trip of a family of Karakimensa before they sold their cart and donkeys, in this novel, Sina and her parents have already given up that way of life. Sina, whose name conjures the color sienna of rust and red dirt, remembers her father's decision to sell their donkeys, Pinky and Haas, and his sadness and regret when he later hears they were sold for slaughter. She remembers her pa's words, "That man should never have shot good donkeys that knew how to plow." Once they are gone, she thinks of their soft grey muzzles and giant ears, and how when she was a baby and couldn't sleep, her pa would lift her onto old Pinky's back as the donkey wandered from bush to bush, pulling at the hard leaves. Boetie does not grow up on a karaki and mocks Sina for her history, though her family take him in for a time. Boetie's early life is spent with Oana and Majola, who work for Baas Jan on his farm, tending pigs and watermelons. Boetie has an early memory of clinging to a woman who was not Oana, on a road somewhere, and someone rolling the woman on her back and discovering him with surprise. Baas Jan is not often at his farm, but on one occasion he returns to find that Majola has allowed his friends, a family of Karakimensa, to camp there. This family is Sina and her ma and pa. In a drunken brandy rage, Boss Jan threatens to shoot the donkeys, and then the family too if they don't leave. His last words are insults to Majola and O Anna before she kills him with a single blow to the head with a spade. Both Boetie and Sina, then young children, witness Boss Jan's murder. The third child is Krikkie. His mother, Dolly, takes the train on Fridays to Annekant, Beaufort West, to work as a prostitute on the N1 highway. During the weekends, she thus leaves Krikkie alone. On one occasion, while running alongside a train to beg for sweets, Krikkie is thrown a packet of jelly tots. As he scrambles to gather the sweets from the dust, two boys attack him. His clenched fists hold the sweets, but the boys smash his knuckles with a rock, leaving his hands permanently damaged. When Dolly doesn't return, the shop lady calls the welfare office to collect Krikkie, after she hears that the police have found Dolly's body in the veld, Annekant, Beaufort West, raped and strangled. Krikkie is taken to Siakogat Primary, where he joins Sina. The only clue to his heritage are his feelings of familiarity and safety in the veld, and a small photograph of Dolly holding him as a baby, standing in front of a spekboom. Because his hands are broken, Krikkie holds them close to his chest, with elbows out, perhaps like a cricket. But his name predates his injuries. Sina can't understand his name because he makes no noise at all. But at the end of the novel, he tells her his mother gave him the name because he jumped like a Krikkie into her arms. Childhood trauma manifests differently for each of the characters, but because of it, all three have the capacity for violence. Sina recognizes something of herself in Krikkie. He was like her, neither a farm child nor a town child, just a person from nowhere. At school, the other children are afraid of him. If the mood took him, Krikkie, even with his crippled hands, could twist a person's arm so that they would be on their knees begging for mercy. Sina tempers him, though, and shows her acceptance by taking his broken hands in hers. Boetie loses both parents when they are arrested, and he becomes hardened. Without family, a ring as impenetrable as one made of long white pendoring had encircled his heart, and his mind was focused only on survival. He grows up in Oudtshoorn, sleeping in a bush alongside the prison, hoping one day to find O Anna. It is a harsh life, and he kills another child over a bottle of petrol. Afterwards, he felt nothing for the dead boy. Instead, there was a hardening within Boetie, and when he walked away, he didn't look back. As an adult, Sina remarks that Boss Jan's murder had been the start of it all. Once you see a person crack another's skull with a spade, smashing a tortoise is easy. Sina too acts violently when she slits Boetie's throat like a sheep. The murder comes in response to weeks of Boetie's physical and emotional abuse, and finally his attempt to molest her younger sister. It is Boetie that smashes a tortoise when they are children. This is the first of 3 encounters Sina has with tortoises in the novel, which demand an ethical response from her, and in so doing show her integration with the Karoo. The tortoise is the key figure in the novel, carrying the story like the shell on its back. In connecting the characters to the Karoo, to each other, and to their ancestors, the tortoise becomes storied matter. The tear of the tortoise in the novel's title comes from a belief also mentioned in Campbell's first novel. There, Kapok tells his son Fancy he mustn't ever bring a tortoise to eat. A tortoise cries only one tear, and that is when it dies. Sina's pa, too, refused to eat a tortoise, no matter how hungry they were and how easy they were to catch. He echoes Kapok when he tells his daughter, "A tortoise cries one tear, Sinaki, and that is when he dies. I don't want to be responsible for that tear." Despite her hunger, he tells her, "No, we will not eat that tortoise." He is one of the wise old men of the Karoo, who has seen everything from the beginning of the world. If you eat a tortoise, everything we know will be forgotten. In her first encounter, Sina finds a tortoise shell and wants to give it to Boetie as a gift. Soon after, they find a real tortoise, a giant of nearly 100 years old. They see him standing in the rushing water, his ancient head turned upwards with his mouth open and gasping for air. Sina wants to help him, but Boetie grabs her arm and tells her, "Los, los." Boetie then picks up a rock and brought it down on the tortoise's shell, so that both ancient creature and the girl cried out together. After this incident, Sina is sent to Seakoichat Primary, while Boetie is abandoned to distant relatives on the N1. At school, she is haunted by guilt and often has bad dreams. She had seen a tortoise's only tear, and afterwards everything had changed. It was true what Pa said. A tortoise was the spirit of the veld. She should have listened to him. When, much later, Sina murders Boetie, she takes to the Sand River Road to return to the safety of her school. While in the veld, she has a second encounter with a tortoise, this time in the company of the spirit of her mother's mother, Oma Lewis. She finds her in a patch of koppies, which feel familiar, and she remarks that the rocks gave her a sense of relief and peace. Oma Lewis offers a different perspective on the tortoise. When they see one hiding under a granaatbos, Sina confesses the guilt she carries. Surprisingly, Oma Lewis says she likes to eat a tortoise in the summer, as their meat is less dry and tough. Her father had told her, there had to be one thing that the earth gave us that is easy to catch and eat. Everything else is such a struggle. But, her Oma tells her, killing a tortoise and not eating it is sure to bring trouble. In the koppies, Oma Lewis tells Sina, we come from the Busman, and how her own father would spot game from where they stood. At first, Sina doesn't understand. No, Oma Lewis, she replies, I am a colored of a Karaki, and then from the Lokasi. Oma Lewis guides her to water and shows her how to safely get honey from the bees, and again Sina feels the peace of the place settle over her. When she says goodbye to the spirit of her grandmother, she realizes that she had not once thought of the murder. After being in the koppies with her Oma Lewis in their place, she notices that her panic had disappeared and her mind was clear. Sina has one final encounter with a tortoise before she collapses near the school. By this point, she is exhausted and severely dehydrated. She sees two young boys trying to decide how to cook and eat a tortoise and warns them, that is an old man of the Karoo. He is the only one who was here at the time of our ancestors. But the children tell her, if we can't eat an old man tortoise, then we will die. The children fall asleep in her arms, but when she wakes, they are gone. Later, Kriki, who has followed her on the Sand River Road, tells her there were no boys and no fire. But when he found Sina, she was asleep, holding onto an old tortoise that was hiding in his big shell. That tortoise wanted to go, but her body was curled right round it, protecting it. At the end of the novel, Sina reflects that there are a lot of tortoises in this veld, but it is those very big ones who are the most precious. They are as old as the Karoo. They have been here forever. Kriki agrees. Yeah, a tortoise is a beautiful thing. And yet, Sina is upset. She thinks because she stopped the starving boys from eating the tortoise, they will die. These encounters draw Sina into an ethical engagement with her environment. While Sina's pa believed tortoises were sacred, the spirit of the veld, and custodians of their ancestral heritage, both Boetie and Oma Lewis, in their own ways, show that sometimes the environment and its creatures help one survive. Through these encounters, Sina develops an awareness of her integration with the environment and thus reconnects with her heritage. As she makes her peace with the tortoise, her own body curled round the storied matter of its shell, she too comes to terms with the trauma of her past. Thank you.
Thank you, Isabel. That was spot on for timing and such a fascinating talk. I'm sure we're going to have a lovely discussion afterwards. And next up, we have Marike Beyers from Amazwi. So she didn't have to travel far to get here. And she's going to be talking about the poetry of Kobus Moolman. Over to you, Marike.
Of stones and mountains, the inner and outer worlds in the poetry of Kobus Moolman. Kobus Moolman is a well-known poet in the South African literary context. He has published 7 poetry collections and 2 chapbooks since 2000. Although he is mostly known in this field, he also has a collection of short stories and radio plays to his name, and his play, Full Circle, won the Pansa News Script Award in 2004 and was also published. His PhD thesis at the UKZN, the autobiography of Bone, considers the formal boundaries between the genres of poetry and drama, and this also indicates his interest in the crossover of these forms of expression. Moolman was born in 1964, and he has committed himself to writing since his youth. His archives at Amazwi hold draft poems, essays, book reviews, scripts and notes for stories since the late 1970s, from high school throughout his student years and thereafter. His submissions of work nationally and internationally attests to his focus, as does his involvement in the literary field in arranging performances and poetry readings, compiling anthologies and working with the Twist Theatre Development Project, and also editing the poetry journal Fidelities for years. In an interview with Slipnet, Moolman said, "I like the fact that drama is the words of a character in the flesh. It is words that exist on the tongue, in the moment, there and then. There is a full-fleshness of drama that really appeals to me, but the communal aspect of theatre I find difficult. The fact that the play has to be staged in front of an audience with all the concomitant issues of production for it to have its real life, this I find a trial. A poem, however, can live in private, in silence, obscurely, without another soul in the world to help it have its life. That I love, really." Looking at Moolman's presence as a poet in South Africa, it seems that he's receiving the Helen Martins Fellowship sponsored by Dalrymple and Ethel Fugard in 1998 was significant in bringing Moolman's poetic expression to a readership. This fellowship allowed him to stay in the Karoo village of New Batesta. In 1999, he self-published a chapbook called Stone Song, based on this residency. In it, he interchanged extracts from his journal and poems written during this time to create a booklet with the feel of a diary, particularly reflecting on the physical landscape. New Batesta poems and longer extracts from the notebook also find their way into Time Like Stone, Moolman's collection of poetry published in 2000, which won the Ingrid Jonker Prize for a debut collection. On the left, you see a manuscript of the poem Three Views of a Karoo Veld, and he was quite initially only kind of had the first 3 lines and complained very much, "Oh, terrible, terrible to have only the 3 lines and to have to abandon the poem," but he did write it later. Three views of a Karoo Veld. Time runs like stone in these parts of bleached grass and bone. Shards of thin sky bleed the veld desolate and dry. Starched wind cart away scales of water from night and the day. Clearly the first stanza felt inspired. The book also takes its title from this first line, though you can note that he changed time flows to time runs in the published version, and it gives it a more tentative feel, more unevenness in the possibility of flight and disturbance and flow. Stone Song reproduced this oh terrible complaint in the manuscript, which is then followed by unrelated description of text after the poem, but in the published version, one does not see this. Much of what is characteristic of Moolman's poetry is present in this poem. Sparse language, startling use of imagery, and a sense of keen observation. Stone, wind, water, and sky are regular elements in his writing. Peter Anderson reasons that Moolman is more than capable of exquisite and telling imagery, but that his poems become less interesting when he adds explanations to it or hint to their meaning. Not that he does it in this poem. Moolman presents a landscape, but in a way that combines nature images and human experience. Stone as a recurring image brings a concern with scale and permanence of mutability and place in the world. Perhaps one can see something of the inserting the writer's concern with representation, interiority, into an observation or description in the following poem. Sky. The sky sits still on an island of intangibility, a blue word without any spelling. Responses to Moolman's work emphasize the startling use of imagery and at times a dreamlike atmosphere. These can perhaps be seen as elements of surrealism, which has a wide applicability, but I mainly find this helpful in the following sense. If one puts surrealism as using highly discordant imagery to create a sense of a dreamlike interior reality, one could perhaps say Moolman uses simple images that can appear in dreams to present specific landscapes or exterior reality that can be recognized almost as from the inside. Take the following poem. It is set in a specific town, the Wind of Batesta. A man wakes up in the howl of the wind in his head in a place of sand and stone. All day the doors on the street are closed against the dust, the wooden window shutters too. On the sun, only the sun seems not to mind, and an old grey donkey that chews slowly on an old rose bush. The whole day the man is indoors. He sees the sky not at all, engrossed so in blustery blue. Reading this, one gets the idea of a response to a specific place, which is part of the observation and part of what is presented, yet one does not have to know the town to get a sense of recognition. The poem asks how we are inside ourselves, inside a place. It pulls at perception, the sense of the inner dislocation by linking images of the wind, the head, and place in the first stanza. And then there's the unusual formulation of the phrase, he sees the sky not at all, that juxtaposes the act of perceiving and recording, an inside and an outside. Blustery blue tugs at one, lending itself to a wind and sky, but given the speaker's indoors preoccupation, to a mood or a state of being as well. Moolman collapses the distinction between inner and outer, and in an interview with Africa in Dialogue, he explains that he tries to blend the distinction between the inside and the outside, between the self and the outside world. So things that happen out in the world do not happen out in the world, they happen at the same time inside the person that is seeing and experiencing those things. It is about seeing oneself in greater connectivity, in a greater way of being part instead of something that is continually on the outside and separate. In that way, the wind, the forces, other human beings' stories and struggles, those are stories that are happening at the same time inside as what is happening outside. This, he said, more than a decade after the publication of Time Like Stone. And in an interview with Die Hard Press about his writing between Time Like Stone and his collection Light and After, he is concerned that his concerns might be the same patch of earth I've walked around and around, the same dry bone I've come back to gnaw. Nevertheless, he has spoken about a turning point in his writing practice after the publication of Light and After, in a long reflective essay, Whose Body Is It and What Is It Doing on My Page? He regards his earlier writing to have been dominated by the lyrical mode and to be image and voice-based poems, where the subjective self spoke to the reader in short, self-contained, personalized utterances. The poems are emotionally charged with dense imagery and inwardly focused. Many of these characteristics have been highly valued, but he had come to be frustrated with the lyrical voice. He wanted a mode that could reflect his changing concerns of language, identity, form, and meaning, and he felt that he made a breakthrough in his sequence of poems Anatomy. This poem won the 2008 Jalro Award for Best Poem published in New Coin, was published in a separate chapbook and also republished in Light and After. His new work crosses genres and are experimental pieces that foreground the non-normative body, and he particularly makes use of the third person as a distancing device to stand back from personal history, and he tries to transmute the personal. Although this represents an aesthetic shift in the writer, the concerns and even techniques are not absent from his earlier work. He has expressed concern with creating art that depends on the artist being umbilically linked to the meaning of their work. In a review of the Owl House, New Batesta Revisited, published in 1999, he considered the position of outsider artists and the obsessive inwards focus of Helen Martins' life work. Perhaps his creation of what I'd call portraits of landscapes is part of his interest in putting his creations outside of himself, a countering perhaps of an impulse to an overwhelming interiority. This is also what readers have responded to consistently in his work, what Anderson called the unwavering receptivity of his eye and his ear, his fidelity to the world. Moolman himself acknowledges a move away from this first-person singular even in his earlier work, and this is particularly true of his presentation of landscape. I do not wish to go into a discussion about the inclusivity or accessibility of a first-person speaking voice as opposed to other modes of address in poetry in general, or even in Moolman's work. His use of the third person has been noted by reviewers before the work he thought of as a turning point, and Aya Salafranca, as for one, particularly did not regard his work as confessional in separating the seas. For interest, I've drawn up a table showing Moolman's use of speakers in different collections. He seems particularly apt at writing poems, particularly of landscapes, without the use of any pronouns. It seems to me that one of the strengths of Moolman's work has been his ability to place readers within a landscape, sometimes of a named geographic place, but most often a small unnamed scene, a backyard, a beach, close to a mountain, by combining keen observation with attention to perception in order to create a strong tonal work of being alive to one's experience of the world. Moolman acknowledges his interest in writing about the natural world in an interview with Michelle McGrain. I'm not a great or knowledgeable naturalist, but I do believe that the non-human world, the world without us, has been around long before us and will continue long after us. We are not that important at all. We have to come back to a proper sense of ourselves and our place in the scheme of things, and in that way the natural world is important to my work. Left Over and A Book of Rooms are books of experimental work consisting of prose poems, in the case of Left Over, and a deliberate lopsided line with a jarring rhythm that holds the work together in the case of A Book of Rooms. Both require to be read as a book, from beginning to end, rather than as a collection of self-contained poems. Ironically, perhaps these works, and to some extent Light and After, received more responses for being inwardly focused and dreamlike than his earlier works. In reviewing Left Over, Calvin Soul describes Moolman as a master of the lyric, but a lyric in which human subjects interact with and are at times overwhelmed by the landscape, objects and natural world with which they are surrounded. The work is concerned with the interface between the inside and the outside, and with the non-normative body, he continues. There's little desire to escape into an inner or subjective world, Soul says, since the poet knows the limitations of such a world. Dennis Hirschen finds that A Book of Rooms appears to be autobiographical, but is presented in the third person so as to create an essential degree of leverage between the writer and his subject. The visual element in the book is very strong, he finds, but paradoxically the contours of the outer world are sucked into inner perception. Hirschen concludes that Moolman has made out of his Book of Rooms an open, if tentative, breathing space, one where the third person, who might well stand for himself, may still be. The lyrical voice representing the personal experience in a way that can resonate, and also the links or unity between inner and outer worlds, and these remain concerns in Moolman's work, and also in his latest work, where there is a very direct engagement with place and reflection on our presence in the natural world. All and Everything, Scenes from a Winter Farmland, is a chapbook, a sequence of meditative and minimalist poems. It is stated that the poems were inspired by time spent on the farm Ekurhuleni in the KwaZulu-Natal Midlands. Although the poems read almost as fragments that come together through a whole reading, I will quote some. Cattle on a distant hill, changing places, running ahead, stopping to graze. How to put back together the logs from an old oak tree. How to replace the long cold days with sunlight. We can see the line, this simple, direct description, each scene an image in itself, not even using metaphors directly. A drawing of our being part of the seasons, and the subtitle, subtle way our needs and our ways of being in the natural world are questioned. There is no door to open, no window to look through. There are walls tight around you, even though they are not in sight. This slide shows Subnam Khan's sketches that mirrors the minimalist approach. It moves into an internal experience, using images of house as familiar metaphors of self, and it gives us a sense of self within a landscape. Tony Voss finds that this imagistic work touches in its lyricism and its thought delicately on many themes, including the natural world, human settlement, and transcendental celebration. The point is that the poetry has discovered a place of peace, has in its sense created a space of peace. Dry grass inside the light, still light like birds, suspended from wind, no sound out or inside of anything, only light is all and everything. Moolman's most recent collection of poems is The Mountain Behind the House. Stuart Payne describes the poems in this collection as presenting a vivid external and internal worlds. The reader is placed in a world tightly organized by concrete images, which can only be approached, where one can approach the internal world only through the arrangements of the poem. The interior and the exterior are no longer distinct. I am that stone. I am that stone, red mountain in the morning. I am that stone that sits, sharp static of cicadas. I am that stone that sits still, sky between wind and rock. I am that stone that burns silently. Here there is surely no embarrassment in the eye as a speaker. It has an inclusive quality. Images from the elemental world and the careful build-up from repeating phrases that extend and add something at each iteration, interspersed with details of place and time. The poems are divided into various sections, most of them including a strong sense of place. Mountain, here, there, mother, everywhere, bone, and nowhere. Metterkamp, being away from South Africa, reads this collection as a homecoming. The book takes me home. It puts me back in touch with myself, and that's a hard and painful and utterly moving experience. Moolman builds list-like images that show him as a poet who thinks and feels and who perceives with his whole being. It is quite a long poem. I think I will only read about the half, but you can notice the kind of, particularly the list-like part. Easter Varkvallei to Makanda. Brown mushrooms in the grass, and tiny yellow flowers, and dry cow pads, and chunks of dry grass, and small pieces of stone, and some broken bricks, and some scuffed patches of bare black earth, and a dead branch, and a piece of rotting wood, and a lump of concrete, and a twisted roll of wire, and a rusted section of iron railing, and a broken fence post, and so on. This gives a listing of perfectly relevant, perfectly observed detail, if also surreal, the familiar as surreal. The more the poet opens to us, Metterkamp reasons, the wonderful thing is about the book is how open and spacious it is, although the poems might seem at first glance to be small. Their preoccupation is with loss and confusion as wide and as hard as the mountains behind the house. To Payne, Moolman's poems have the suggestive quality of paintings. It gives us transfigured worlds through which we might consider our own experience, and this aligns with Moolman's view that the part of the job of poets and art is to read past what we already know, to seek a range of forms that will not so much be original, as all language is recycled, as an illumination, a light slanting in through the dust from a totally different angle. In an interview on the importance of art and literature being part of the whole, Moolman said, "Literature lets in, it lets the world in. For me, my works don't come from me, they come through me. What is on the other side of me, I don't know. That is a place of origins. It is from a place that is much bigger and deeper and darker and older than me. It's about my own personal relationships with things that are bigger than me, with a world that is bigger than me and which existed before me and will exist after me." Thank you.
Thank you so much, Marike. That was a fascinating paper, and it's always lovely when you listen to papers and they start to speak to each other in interesting ways. So this is great. And now we're heading over to Anthea Garman, who's from Rhodes University, and is going to be talking on, I left my piece of paper, and I'm not going to try, the word that that was introduced yesterday, anthropomorphisation. It's a word I knew but haven't had to actually say before. So thank you, Anthea. We look forward to hearing your paper.
He has to say anthropomorphisation about 10 times in this paper. Okay, sorry. Thanks. In interviews about his novel, The Overstory, Richard Powers has spoken about his attempts to make the many ancient trees of Turtle Island, or North America, into fully fledged literary characters. His narratival choices have meant that accusations of anthropomorphism have been levelled at this work. But Powers has responded by unashamedly asserting that the current state of the planet requires a form of anthropomorphisation, which allows humans to step into a wider life consciousness. How Powers uses and navigates the anthropomorphisation of the trees he chooses as his characters, and how he weaves a story of human and trees that is grounded in the very latest biological science, is the subject of this paper. So let's begin by listening. First there was nothing, then there was everything. Then in a park above a western city after dusk, the air is raining messages. A woman sits on the ground, leaning against a pine. Its bark presses hard against her back, as hard as life itself. Its needles scent the air and a force hums in the heart of the wood. Her ears tune down to the lowest frequencies. The tree is saying things in words before words. It says, "Sun and water are questions endlessly worth answering," it says. "A good answer must be reinvented many times from scratch." It says, "Every piece of earth needs a new way to grip it." A thing can travel everywhere just by holding still. A chorus of living wood sings to the woman, "If your mind were only a slightly greener thing, we'd drown you in meaning." Anthropomorphisation, such a dirty word. It's an interesting conjunction of agreement that in both science and literature, the attempt to anthropomorphize is severely condemned. In science, it's an unforgivable overstepping of the subjective-objective boundary, which keeps humans from contaminating their studies, samples, and findings. In literature, it's a little trick of writing that's used a lot, but usually confined to material written for children, where its cutesy, imaginative possibilities can do no harm. To anthropomorphize in both fields as a serious scientist or writer is to declare oneself a maverick outlier who doesn't understand the rules or the stakes of the game one is playing. To anthropomorphize is to turn into human with human understandings and human feelings, to attribute one's own feelings as scientist or writer to the subject matter. It's an unforgivable merging of one's own boundaries with another thing, as Peter Wohlleben, the German forester, discovered when he published the book The Hidden Life of Trees, What They Feel, How They Communicate in 2015. His poetic writing, his use of metaphor, and a general emotionality resulted in a petition from the University of Göttingen, in which some scientists said it represented unenlightened thinking, harking back to the early modern world before the Enlightenment, where science and imagination were more or less merged, and that the work should not be classified as popular science. The petition was titled, "Even in the Forest, It's Facts We Want," instead of fairy tales. In particular, biologist Sharon Elizabeth Kingsland pointed out that although Wohlleben had employed hard scientific research with scientifically verified biological explanations for various forest phenomena, and he had made valid points about how ecological relationships operate in the forest, nevertheless, his use of scientific literature is often a springboard to an imagined conclusion that goes beyond scientific facts. So here is the forbidden conclusion, the boundary that cannot be crossed, that the other than human does not have sentience, cannot know and have knowledge, does not feel, cannot communicate. But there is a further point to be made, and one that touches on the very subject matter of this conference. The knowledge that is constructed in poetic, imaginative, aesthetic, and empathetic ways, and the knowledge that is constructed through observation and careful proof are still struggling to come together and form one knowledge system. More than that, we are still struggling to admit that our planet has sentience, can run things very well without us, and can teach us wisdom. Anthropomorphisation in the hands of Richard Powers. Powers has not suffered the fate of Peter Wohlleben. Scientists have not risen up to warn against the dangers of the overstory. Powers is not a scientist, and so has escaped their censure. But nevertheless, he's doing the same kind of work, asking us, his readers, to rethink our supremacy and our security in our knowledge systems, asking us to encounter trees and their ways of being, asking us to listen and to learn, asking us to extend our boundaries beyond the human. How does he anthropomorphize his central characters? How does he gently lead us towards and across that boundary that marks the limits of human knowing? Primarily, and to start with, in the first section of the book called Roots, he does it through a simple association with a human. As in the very first piece I read to you from the book, he has a human touch a tree, sit still with it, lean into it, and listen. He has a human extend themselves imaginatively into the past, into the future, into the ground beneath them, into the sky above. This is subtle and stealthy. The 9 humans of this overstory each have an association with a tree or trees, and that is a simple, commonplace connection, and one which many of us will instantly recognize. Nicholas Hurl, great-great-great-grandson of Norwegian immigrants who moved from New York to Iowa with chestnuts in their pockets, which they plant. A single tree survives far from its origin place and becomes huge enough to become a beacon in flat farmland, a marker for travelers. In this chapter, the many generations of Hurls come and go terribly fast as the tree establishes and grows slowly, very slowly, into a giant. As a reader, there's no escaping the breathless sense of how short a human life is, how fleeting against the magnificence of this extraordinary out-of-place tree. I think of that out-of-place tree I would always note when driving to the old Durban airport south of the city. The tree stood tall and erect in a tiny green corner created by the overpasses. It breathed in carbon monoxide, and it breathed out glorious generosity. Mimi Ma and the mulberry. Mimi Ma is a second-generation Chinese immigrant. From Shanghai to America, her father brings with him 3 jade rings of carved mulberry trees representing past, present, and future. He marries, produces 3 girls. They settle in Illinois and plant a mulberry tree. How simple the longing for home. How simple the need to taste mulberries. How lovely the urge to climb the tree as a child and just munch on mulberries all afternoon. I've come down from mulberry trees with my hands, feet, and legs stained red from just such an afternoon. Adam Appich and the maple. The Appich father planted a tree for each of his 5 children, and Adam got the maple. This story fills me with longing. Nobody planted a tree to mark my birth on earth. but I do know a poet who's done this very act in her garden for each of her grandchildren. Ray Brinkman meets Dorothy Kazali and wants to date her. As a test, she insists they audition for an amateur theatre production. He gets the part of a tree in the Great Burnham Wood. My very first role on stage was a tree. I had hoped for Bess, the highwayman's lover. When I was in black tights and black swimming costume with leaves pinned on, my uncle warned me to watch out for passing dogs. Douglas Pavlicek, a loadmaster in the Vietnam War, has to bail out of a burning plane and is saved by a banyan, which catches the strings of his parachute. Not so mundane, but often the stuff of many a war movie we have seen. Later in the book, after a lifetime of wandering, he will come to know, love, and lay down his life for his namesake, Douglas firs. Nile Mehta, another offspring of an immigrant, a computer nerd, and then millionaire game developer, Nile falls out of a Spanish oak and is paralyzed as a young boy. All those warnings to me not to climb too high, not to be lured by the topmost, most bendy branch in the wind. All these simple little interweavings, humans and trees, mundane, familiar, unremarkable. But then come two women, one hearing-impaired, speech-impaired botanist whose work will shift science and the world, and one who has no association with the tree, except that outside her student dig stands a ginkgo biloba, a maidenhair, which he passes each day without recognition until so much later. These two characters will have profoundly destabilizing experiences that pitch the book into the politically charged moment we now live in. The realization that we're losing the world's forests, fresh air, atmosphere, seasons, and our casual familiarity with other living things. It is the botanist, Dr. Patricia Westerford, based on the boundary-breaking work of Suzanne Simard, who is the human character, who shifts the book into a more urgent political place, away from the familiar and the safe. Making use of Simard's insights into tree signaling, which is careful science speak for communication, Powers creates a character who speaks for the trees only to be cut down in the same way Voljevan experienced. Westerford presents her findings at a conference and publishes them, but is immediately denounced by senior male scientists. Patricia Westerford displays an almost embarrassing misunderstanding of the units of natural selection. Even if a message is in some way received, it would be in no way implied that such a message had been sent, say the scientists. Westerford loses her university post and goes into hiding among trees. She becomes a wilderness ranger in a national park. She lives in isolation in a small cabin. She walks the forests and she cleans up after the humans who visit. For years, this is her life until she comes across a group of botanists studying a dead log. Very quickly, they work out who she is, the mother of a whole new science about understory tree life. While she's been living with the trees, her paper has found curious adherents who've gone on to test her ideas, and now here they are, scientists like her who listen and who are not afraid to learn, and thus the rehabilitation of Dr. Westerford happens in the most satisfying way. She picks up her work again, enriches it, and deepens it. It takes an electric shock from a faulty light switch, which kills the other character, Olivia Vandergriff, to set off another trajectory which carries the book. Vandergriff falls out of bed dead, and hitting the floor, her heart starts again. The incident jolts her out of her compromise of a life. She asks, I'm listening, what do you want from me? Many pages later, and many wanderings around the country in her car, the answer comes, the most wondrous things alive need you. Throughout this book, Powers layers small human tree connection upon small human tree connection. But he also laminates into the story the ubiquity of tree products in our lives, so that trees are everywhere. Floorboards, desks, chairs, cupboards, tables, all with names. Powers never lets us forget their identities and their distinctivenesses. Now she sits on the white pine floor, near where the oak table made by Nick's great-great-grandfather stood forever. Dimples in the floorboards will remember it forever. Powers is steadily moving his characters towards an encounter with the oldest and largest trees in America, the Sequoia sempervirens, and the predatory timber companies who mine them. Wide-awake Olivia, who now has a calling stronger than a medieval nun's, finds artist Nick, and they set out for California to join the tree warriors, fighting for the last remaining old-growth forests. They christen themselves with forest names that night in the soft drizzle of the redwoods on a blanket of needles. The game seems childish at first, but all of art is childish, all storytelling, all human hope and fear. Why shouldn't they take new names for new work? Trees go by a dozen different labels, like a man with a drawer full of fake passports. In one place there's lime, in another linden, tilia at large, but basswood when turned into lumber or honey, 28 names for longleaf pine alone. He reaches out and takes a fingerful of that wheaty stuff that fans out under his fingers. Maidenhair, he says. In an interview with PBS NewsHour, Powers said that he was teaching at Stanford, and to escape the present and the future being made by the university's neighbors, Apple, Google, etc., he would go up into the second growth forest to walk. One day I came across an escapee, a redwood that had somehow evaded the loggers when they cut down the forest to build San Francisco and lay the track for the Transcontinental Railroad. This single monster tree was as wide as a house, as tall as a football pitch was long, and almost as old as Jesus. The encounter was the beginning of reading, in which Powers discovered that 98% of the California forests had been logged, and then the beginning of writing. I read over 120 books about trees. From out of this reading, there grew a large branching fable, part ancient myth and part contemporary political showdown. And so when the showdowns, plural, come, it falls to Patricia and Olivia to speak for the trees. And in the case of Maidenhair's love of Mimas, this is the closest we come to a tree taking on human character and dialogue. We've got a legacy tree sit that needs banning. Anyone up for a brief stint up top? He opens his eyes on the trunk of Mimas, the largest, strongest, widest, oldest, surest, sanest living thing he has ever seen. Keeper of 500,000 days and nights, and it wants him in his crown. He wobbles out on a waving branch. The wind blows, and Mimas's entire crown dips and bucks. He'll die, plunged 20 stories onto a bed of ferns. Maidenhair tells him, Mimas says he won't let us fall. Powers evokes the eco-warriors, binding themselves to individual legacy trees in order to mark them as extraordinary and to give them status and personhood in the public mind, speaking for the trees by both action and declaration. But he marries this politically controversial human-tree relationship with the work of the scientist, who after painstaking years is able to tell a story for the public in the media, via a book and interviews, and then as an expert witness in a court case. The self-effacing Dr. Patricia Westerford finds all the attention debilitating. It's your life's work. You can't walk away now. It's not my life's work. My life's work is listening to trees. No, that's your life's play. The work part is telling people what they're saying. In this crowning part of the book, we hear the trees through the imaginative and emotive bonding with the tree that Olivia, Maidenhair, will give her life for, and we hear the trees through the meticulous and rigorous work Dr. Westerford publishes. But other characters, too, are speaking for them. Ray Brinkman, the property lawyer, is investigating legal personhood for trees. Douglas Pavlicek and Mimi Ma are carrying out acts of destruction against loggers and forestry companies. Adam Apich, now a psychologist, is studying the motivations of eco-warriors. Nile Mehta has turned his massive online game from conquering worlds to making worlds. This speaking for is the culminating anthropomorphization that Powers employs, and he does it with a moral imperative. The trees must be spoken for, and it must be done scientifically, aesthetically, affectively, aggressively, legally, and digitally. So to sum up, anthropomorphization, subtle and stealthy. I said earlier, Powers uses a subtle and stealthy form. So let me summarize how I see it working in this book. It starts with mundane, quotidian, simple human tree connections that nudge us, telling us, you too have trees in your life, not one but many. We are embedded as readers with his characters in tree time, immense, filling ages, and in tree space, another universe under the tarmac, another universe above our heads. We're immersed in tree ubiquity through the products we've made from trees. Even the book in our hands has its name from the beech tree. We are urged to listen to trees, recognizing their sovereignty on this planet, and we are compelled to speak for them. And then I hope you can give that just a little read, Patricia's prayer to the cedar.
Next conference, we should arrange the speakers by height. Okay, thank you so much, Anthea. That was another fascinating paper. And we're now going to open for questions, discussions. Just a reminder to the people online that we are monitoring the chat and the question and answer. So if you have questions, post them there. We'll open to the floor first, and then we will check in so you can type up your questions. While people might be just getting ready, if you can wave your hand, I can sort of see through the glare. Just while people are thinking about that as well, just something that struck me, both Marike and Isabel, in your papers, there's a sense you talked about Kobus Moolman talking about the same acre of earth that he sort of looks at, and I'm thinking of Campbell, who has, now I'm not sure if all three or if 2 out of her 3 novels have been set very definitely in the Karoo with the Karabki people. And I just wondered if either of you wanted to respond to that sense of their exploration of these issues. Okay, where is our microphone? Okay. Okay.
I think that when Kobus himself particularly said, the same gnawing in these same old bones, I think he was a bit saying, well, you're now doing some new work, but I think he was referring, to a general sense of, but our concerns remain the same as, or to some extent is an extension of our own consciousness or what he is working on and in. I mean, I find it that after that he quite often spoke as if he had this huge turning point, but I don't think that there were that much, I don't think readers actually responded to the turning point in itself. I think one does what he considered the turning point. I don't think that when he started speaking out, he's going to write in the third person, that he felt it, he did it for a specific effect, but I don't think that, I think readers found themselves inside his writing in the earlier works and in the later ones in the interior. So in that sense, the concern of communicating, I think, the interior and exterior reality, I think, is a concern that is in his work that he's been dealing with throughout. So in that sense, I think that's, I'm not sure if I'm answering your question.
Okay.
I think it has to do with the concerns of representing your reality.
Okay. Okay, if we could get to Isabel and then.
Thanks, Crystal. I think to answer, I'll just give a little bit of background on Carol Campbell, and that her and her family had lived in Prince Albert running a petrol station for 12 years, and a lot of the people that make their way into her novel are based on people she'd seen. So I think that gives her first and her third novel this real sense of locatedness in the Karoo. And her novel in between is set in Oudtshoorn, and there she looks at the issues with RDP housing. So again, and some critic has described it as social realism. So yeah, I would say it really brings a sense of the Karoo and its people and the place. Yeah.
Thank you. All right, are there any questions in the room? Is there a hand there? Yes, right at the back.
Mine is to thank Isabel. Thank you very much, because as I'm seated here, I began to be mindful of the perceptions that our elders implant on the young generation's mind in terms of the discourses that they frequently repeat until they are like their culture of becoming environmentally unfriendly. When the tortoise cry, and the grandmother has actually made sure that the story resonates with Sino. There is a saying that Inkawi kiwilile mdanzane. That came to my mind as you were talking, because I've known that when you say Inkawi kiwilila, which means that there is no mercy, it's a merciless society, and this on its own made me feel good that I grew up in Tsomo, where there is a song, "Qhele Tsomo, sanalwam dine bongo sanalwam," where there is something else different that you have to breastfeed your child. So thank you for raising that as very important. To you, Anthea, I want to commend you for making it sync with me why we took that tour with Basil yesterday to the environment here. When you mention the tree breathing the carbon dioxide and as a sign of generosity, I'm reminded of how Dr. Gcina Masiko struggled to negotiate with the officials to render her permission to create that tree at the bluff to become a storytelling tree, and how from the officials it was difficult for them to understand what that meant. And you mentioned the storytelling tree that is intended in this building, where you echoed it as a space of natural environmental friendly green space that is Amazwi, which we know it has been called the National English Literal Museum, which is on its own a sign of decoloniality that needs to be harnessed, because in it you are mentioning also trees as the legacy, which would enable curatorship by the people who, meaningful curatorship by various people who come here, of people who come to the building, and their stories being archived meaningfully for future access in the building. So for me, I'm listening with practical consideration of how continuity and transformation, and in terms of meaningful, the practicality of why we are here and why we are listening to your presentation. Thank you very much, Anthea, for bringing that thought to me, and thank you, Basil, for yesterday's talk.
Okay. Anthea, would you like to respond to that in any way? You think, okay, it's more a comment. Okay, are there any more hands there? Can't actually see. Lynn, do we have any questions online? Sorry, okay, sorry, is there nothing? Okay, maybe if we can just get those. Sorry, we just need the mic. If you could just read some of the comments, that might be.
Anthea, this is from Harry to you. Opinion, anthropomorphizing acknowledges, it seems to me, the arrogant human insistence on our separation from and implied superiority to the natural world. It is a necessary and timely literary device. Used well, it is neither childish nor unscientific. And then we'll scroll down. There we go. And then all art is childish or childlike. Sorry. All art is childish or childlike.
Okay. We have a hand there. Thank you.
Hi, my question is for the Overstory novel. What do you think the importance of having Olivia's character die? What was the significance of her having a death experience and then coming back to life for the story and its direction that it took and its impact on the main characters?
I suppose it is that, so it's a literal jolt that a life ended. So we talk to people who've had near-death experiences, it seems to have exactly that effect where you think, did this happen for a reason? I suppose this is what human beings are always doing. They're making meaning. But the life that Powers has embedded Olivia in very much is a kind of, she's a student, she's not studying what she wants to study. It doesn't give her joy in the world. She doesn't feel like it's a calling. I can't quite remember what she's doing. It's something that obviously is terribly important in the capitalist economy, But she doesn't have good relationships with the people that she's in this digs with. It just shows her as a person who's kind of almost obliterating her own senses all the time. She drinks a lot. She's sleeping around casually. She doesn't have meaningful experiences. She doesn't value her own life really. And it's also kind of the hinge of the book, which is interesting, So that whole first section of the book in which all these characters are separate, it ends with her death. And then you turn over the page and she's alive again. So, it's a kind of literal jolt also to the, literal in the other sense, jolt to the reader. So I think it's probably saying, if you live an insentient life, you're not letting yourself feel, then your life has a high degree of meaninglessness. So that little quote, she now has a calling that's stronger than a medieval nun's. That's somebody else commenting on her. I think it's a wake up to feel, to open oneself. If one does open oneself, and then there are 2 deaths for Olivia, So when you first started talking, I thought you were talking about her second death, actually, And I suppose, that's the kind of this tricky thing about being sentient and allowing oneself to feel and allowing oneself to connect, is that one makes oneself vulnerable to all sorts of things. But certainly to death. So does that help you grapple with it a little bit? Look, it's as much a literary device as it is as anything else going on in the book, yeah.
Okay. Did I see a hand back there? Or was it someone just... Okay. All right, I'm just going to come... Yes, Anthea has a question, yes.
So since this morning's session, I've been thinking about what we bring, as readers and writers or, humans to our projects. And it seems to me that the Karoo is often a vehicle for people's despair or alienation. So much of literature depicts the Karoo in these very stark, kind of despairing sorts of ways. So, and I think I'd always visited the Karoo kind of like in winter. I don't know why, it just so happened that way. And then one year we had visiting family from Australia, and they happened to be here over December, and I thought, oh my gosh, it's going to be hot. But they wanted to go to the Karoo. We had the most extraordinary experience of this, flowering, brilliant, clear blue skies, just this extraordinary, overwhelming experience of how extremely beautiful it is and how hospitable because unlike being towards the coast where things are so humid and hot, the Karoo was lovely. You know, it was hot, but it was just really nice. So I suppose I had a sort of jolt in my own understanding that it wasn't this terribly bleak place that I always thought of it. But I can't say that in literature I encounter anything other than bleak, you know, and I'm wondering what that is. Why go to the Karoo all the day? But partly because I'm asking the question, you know, absolutely, I understand the literary thing. Go to the place that's bleak in order to talk about, you know, end of life and destruction and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But is it doing, so I suppose this is the question, is it doing the place itself a great disservice to make it, you know, the backdrop to the human stuff? Or, you know, what's going on in that relationship? So it's really a question to both Marike and Isabel.
Okay.
Thanks.
Well, do you want to pass the mic to Isabel to respond first?
Yeah, thank you for that. And I think part of my interest in the Karoo is part of a bigger project on deserts in southern Africa and looking at how they've been represented in literature. And there's really this old kind of Western conception of deserts as dry and hospitable and desolate places. So I think part of what I'd like to do is look at where they're not shown as that, they're shown as something else, as places that also nurture and shelter and protect people. Even though they are harsh and dry and hot, they can be other things. So yeah, I think it's kind of in the direction I'm heading towards and hoping to look at the Karoo in that kind of way. Yeah, and I think it really has dominated in Western understandings of the desert. If you look at commentary on, or even fiction in Australia and in American deserts, there's often this just idea that deserts are awful places, but there's a lot of life in them. So yeah, it's quite interesting.
If you can take it to Marike there at the door. Yeah, but if you want to respond first, and then we will go to Dan. No, Marike, if you'll just first give your response to the question. Otherwise we're going to get sidetracked.
I don't think that Moolman specific, I mean, there are, I have now read the initial poems from him from the Karoo, but he himself writes quite generally about other places as well, from a general road trip from all over, and I think his concern is quite often more, I almost want to say that inner outer way, and it quite often merges with a kind of a symbolic understanding of the self and the unity between self and place. So I don't think that he's trying to represent the Karoo or the desert in itself. I would almost like and say you would probably have to ask a place like who's the people in Cradock that we are actually very happy to do all these kind of literary festivals and represent things. I don't seem to really think that the Karoo is being done hard by. In my impression, you know, there's quite there was a wonderful celebratory program of Dion Meyer reading various writings written in the Karoo. So I'm not sure that it is necessarily read as, oh, we never places that we want to turn away from, which is also not just a. You know, I'm not going to pull out extra, but I think people's response to a place is not necessarily even. Are not as straightforward, I think. One's identity or response to a place and where you are in yourself, I think, is not as simple as that.
Okay. All right. Dan, mic coming to you.
Yeah, I know of at least a couple of works of the Karoo that are very positive. Isabel, you may know it. Is it called Manna in the Desert? Or some title like that, written by a Karoo farmer who, unfortunately, whose name I can't remember. Not a great writer, but really bringing out the life of the Karoo in much more positive ways, and obviously a farmer who nurtures the wild as well as his agricultural activities. I have it at home. I'll dig it out for you, Isabel. If you like. And I think Tony Blacklaw's in Blood Orange. He's quite sensitive to the beauty of the Karoo, if I remember right. It's a long time since I read it. I can't recall the detail. And I just wanted to say one other thing, partly following on from that online comment about anthropomorphization. I think there's a growing literature now, even among scientific types, that it's a very, very valuable tool in creating new, what David Warburton would call assemblages. And it's an extension of what we do with each other. It's an imagining of response in the other, and we do it with other humans. We imagine what the response would be to things we say, even though we can't actually be in the other's head, and we extend that to animals more easily. But why not to insects? Why not to trees? Why not to whole environments? I think places like Ecuador are now legally according personhood to entire environments, to entire catchment areas and so on, so that they have a certain legal weight. It's not anthropomorphization as such, but it's moving in that direction. And I think it's becoming much more acceptable than your initial characterization. But it's, yeah, that negativity is still there for sure. Yeah.
Okay. Oh, okay, just Anthea, just wait for the mic, otherwise the people online can't hear you. Thanks, Dan.
No, I fully accept that. But, you know, the response to that earlier book was the one about the German forests is 2016. You know, it's only 6 years ago. And the response from the scientists was in 2018, 2019. So there certainly is, you know, there moves, absolutely there moves. And, you know, one can see it as Powers said, you know, sit down to read books about trees. You've got hundreds of choices now, whereas 10 years ago you wouldn't have had that access into this knowledge. But, you know, certainly there are there's certain rigidities that are still there. So, I mean, I fully accept that there are shifts, but the rigidities are powerful. Yeah,
Okay.
thanks.
All right, can we send the mic back to Lynn? We've got one last question online.
I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing this person's name correctly, but it's Agogo. Aghogho. Agogo. Ah, thank you. Okay, asks, perhaps we can understand these dominant representations of the desert as barren against the backdrop of the extractive/exploitative tendencies of the Anthropocene.
Okay, it's a bit of a comment rather than a question, but would any of our speakers like to respond to that? Yeah.
Yeah, thanks, Agogo, for that comment. Yes, I would agree. Thinking about the desert as barren, in a way, makes it easier to take control of. So if there are resources in the desert, kind of painting this picture that the desert has nothing, it's easier to colonize, I suppose. And there is a lot of contention in Australia, I know, where Aboriginal people had been considered nomadic, and it was easier to kind of take land from them because they were considered nomadic. But there are a lot of critics challenging that assumption of nomadism, and that they were actually settled and moved around in specific places. So, yeah, calling something a desert, it definitely kind of opens the door to other possibilities or ways of using it or utilizing it, I would imagine.
Okay, thank you. And then, oh, all right. Yes, so I think that's a good point to end, but something that struck me as well, it's one of the lovely things with conferences, you start seeing echoes coming out in different papers, that several of the papers in this session touch back to what came out in the previous section as well, about the breaking down of the barriers between the mind, the body, the environment, the linkages between ourselves and the rest of the world. And I think that's quite an interesting, that is coming through in poetry, in fiction, in so many ways. All right, thank you, everyone.